Tech Propaganda, an introduction to critical thinking and technology. My name is Noah Gift. Let's talk through some of the key issues here with tech propaganda. First up, we have the concept of FOMO, or fear of missing out. This is a common way of creating propaganda, is you create this desire to, use something quickly, or else you'll have a disadvantage. Some examples could include a rush to implement generative AI without a clear ROI. The competitors are doing it, so I must do it. We also have skill development. So many technology workers might be concerned that if they don't quickly learn, how to do copy paste with generative AI, their current skills will be obsolete. And then also venture capital is worried that if they don't invest in the next GenAI company, they'll miss out on the next big thing. Another common form of tech propaganda we hear is this naive utopianism. So an example would be all technology is by default good. And so this is really a premise of many utopian ideas throughout history that have turned bad. For example, we've seen this with socialism or communism, that by itself some of the ideas are quite good, but the implementation without proper regulation or trade-offs turns out to be dystopian. And so utopia easily turns to dystopia, and we can see here an example would be smartphone scrolling. Well, that's not actually good. We don't want more is better. We want to have some kind of regulation around that, or useful use of scrolling. So more of it isn't better automatically. Connecting people via social media. This is a common thing you've heard. Oh, we're connecting people. Well, what does that mean? I'm connecting people. Is it going to lead to world peace, or is it going to potentially cause lots of harm? Because people that wouldn't necessarily be connected, that have problems, connect with other people that have problems, and then real world harm occurs. Also, you hear naive things like, well, we'll just do universal basic income via crypto, which is magic beans. Well, magic beans have no value. So by displacing people and giving them magic beans, does that really solve any problems? Also, we've heard things about education. Well, let's just replace the teachers with chatbots, right? AI education for all. That's a very naive way to think. And then disruption. You hear this quite a bit as well, is that this is this technological solutionism. So everything has a technological solution. But the problem with this is it ignores negative externalities. So for example, if you get rid of all of the taxi drivers, what about the money they paid for the medallions? What about unlimited traffic inside of a city, et cetera, et cetera? So this idea that all disruption is good really is a naive way to look at utopianism. We also have this concept of selling two-day-old fish. And this is a common problem if you go to a supermarket and you're looking at buying some kind of fish or meat, etc. A lot of times they'll say, hey, what about these scallops? Well, they're telling you that because it's old fish and they got to get rid of it quickly. Maybe it's on a discount. And a lot of times education providers, let's say a professor or a technology company that provides courses and training material, they already have content on a particular technology, and they say, look, we have these courses and books, and they make a lot of money right now. So let's ignore improvements that maybe make things more safe or more performant. Some examples would be, exaggerating the job market demand for technology, appealing to authority. So, oh, well, this big tech company uses this technology, so you should use it too. Also, dismissing newer languages as unnecessary or overly complex, or why, this new language is too hard to learn, or, this language that we're all using currently isn't actually old and slow. You can do this and this and this and this to not make it old and slow. So you hear this quite a bit as this rationalization of all the problems the language has. But ultimately what this comes down to is a misunderstanding at a very deep level of the concept of an S-curve. What an S-curve means is that there's a growth phase and then there's a plateau. All languages, all technologies have an S-curve, and then the future means that there's going to be improvements. And so it's important to think about not just the current peak of the S-curve, but also the growth phase. Superficial media is a common thing where propaganda is spread, and a lot of times it's the appearance of useful information, but it's implemented as magical thinking. So some examples would be any media that monetizes their podcast, for example, via supplements. And the reason for this is that there's almost no evidence that supplements do anything other than take your money. And so if somebody's selling you something that has no proven benefits by the scientific community, you can guess that potentially other things they're doing also have no scientific benefit. Conspiracy theory forums, this is kind of an easy one, right? If you're thinking about conspiracy theories like flat Earth, there's not a lot of deep thinking happening. Also, podcast hosts with little experience in the topics discussed. So, for example, a podcast host that's discussing AI and they have no background in AI, no educational experience, no background putting it into production. That might be a misinformation or propaganda section because the host can't call the guests out on things because they don't understand the topic they're promoting. Also, sensational predictions about the future with little to no evidence. We hear this a lot on podcasts. Oh, AGI is coming next week, or this super crypto thing is happening, but where's the evidence that that's actually happening? And then oversimplification of complex topics. You'll hear this a lot with propaganda is, oh yeah, well, we can just give everybody universal income and it'll solve all the problems that we're doing because of the technology we're deploying, et cetera, et cetera. It's really a way of glossing over something. And so oversimplification is really a common pattern in these forms of propaganda. We also have this attitude of push to disrupt. So what this means is that you have an overconfidence in technology to solve complex problems. Some examples would be, hey, look, let's just figure out the business model later. I'm sure it'll work. Or let's go ahead and push this product to the market before they actually work. For example, you could make that critique about self-driving cars or social media or iPhones or generative AI. Do we actually know exactly the pros and cons of this? Does the public deserve to have better testing? Another one is ignoring the negative externalities as well. So, oh yeah, let's disrupt. Well, what about actually the commons? What about the effects on other people? Aren't those equally as important as the technology? And then dismissing critics as just not understanding the vision. So this is a really common way to critique people with propaganda, is if there's a valid critique like, well, wait a second, you're actually breaking the law. Shouldn't we be thinking about the current laws? Well, you just don't understand the vision. Billionaireism is another form of propaganda we see over and over again, and it's a Masonic billionaire tech founder worship form of propaganda. And so you can see this with blog posts, for example, that literally say this. They say billionaires build, right? So we need more billionaires. Billionaires are the ones that are solving real problems, not, regular people. And then also extreme wealth really means that you know everything, right? So this is a common trope that isn't true. Idolization of tech billionaires as infallible, right? If someone has $1 billion and they're in tech, that must mean they're a visionary. This is actually discounting the fact that luck is a key role in success. Also, romanticizing Harvard or Stanford genius dropouts, like, oh, well, someone who dropped out of Harvard or Stanford, they're a genius. Everybody should drop out of Stanford and Harvard. And really, this comes down to this concept of ignoring luck versus skill. Sure, there's some skill involved, but also there's a lot of luck as well. We also have the overemphasis on the individual genius versus the team doing the work. And so you'll see this a lot in these billionaireism type propaganda messages where it's all about a particular genius, but the scientific research around performance shows that the team is the one that's actually doing the work. So, launching rockets into space, who's doing the work? A billionaire, or is it actually the team that's actually doing the work that's making the rocket go into space? Next up, we have irrational exceptionalism. And so what this means is that there's a belief that startups themselves are uniquely destined for extraordinary success, but the evidence itself doesn't support that, right? So some examples would be that most startups fail, but we're different. And I think the statistics are that, something like 90% of startups fail. In fact, you could even say that something like 1% are even profitable at any point in their history. And this is a statistically incorrect way to think about the world. Also, you hear things like weekends are a social construct. You should just work on the weekends, or we're changing the world. That's why you need to do all these strange things or work really hard. Also, rationalization of the present hardships because in the future everything's going to be much better. Also, just really looking at the people that are failing constantly in these startups and dismissing these failures as just something that won't apply to you, even though they do apply. And then also the glorification of extreme effort and sacrifice. Of course, the sacrifice and effort is done by the workers, but the portfolio holders of venture capital are able to benefit from the indexing of the risk. We also have this concept of doubling down. And this is a really common one we hear in terms of propaganda, is that you create bigger and bigger claims to distract from the original claim. So, for example, you say self-driving cars will be here next year. It doesn't happen. And you say, oh, wait a second, we're actually going to Mars, right? So it's really a way of, hey, look over here. Even though I made this claim that's completely ridiculous, I'm going to make an even more ridiculous claim to distract you from the first ridiculous claim. Likewise with GenAI models, they have flaws, but don't worry, the next model is going to be sentient. We have, artificial general intelligence, and it's going to be smarter than humans. So don't worry about this particular flaw. So it's really a way of making an even bigger claim to distract from the original claim. And you just keep making those claims and continually distracting people, and they won't notice the original claims that you've been incorrect about. We also have the concept of a Trojan Horse product. And this is a very common one as well. In the venture capital space, is you create an open source product that uses community labor. So, hey, let's go ahead and we'll build the community together. But then later, once it's successful, it's got market adoption. The company then forks it to a commercial license and basically completely destroys all of the goodwill of the users. And this is the rug pull strategy, right? And it's a very common strategy in venture capital. And this fake helpful project is really designed to get the market adoption through goodwill, but ultimately it's only going to benefit one person, which is the owner of that particular project. And then finally, we have what I would call the generous poor ethical framing. So what this means is that instead of framing the ethical problem holistically and covering both the good and the bad, you reframe the problem to what your company actually is doing, but you ignore the true externalities. So for example, you'll see this a lot with companies that have social media. They'll say, hey, we have unbiased training sets, we're hiding, but at the same time, you're hiding the addictive social media feed, for example. So you focus on the things that you're good at, like, oh, well, we don't collect biased data, but you minimize the other things like, well, we stole all of the intellectual property, but we minimize the output of the generative AI model. So this is a very tricky one that is also very important to watch out for. Is someone says that they're doing good, but actually they're generously describing a aspect of what they're doing with ethical AI, but not getting the entire problem and not truly talking about the externalities. Business model circular logic is another form of propaganda. And what this is that a company will exploit a gray area. So they do something that harms the, start again, 3, 2, 1. Business model circular logic is a common way that companies use propaganda. So they'll exploit a gray area that harms the commons, and then they claim that the business model itself depends on that gray area. So wait a second, why aren't we talking about the actual harm that you did initially? Why are we talking about how you must continue to do the harm in order to have a business model? Well, you created the business model. So the business model itself is the issue, not the actual gray area that you're talking about that must exist. And so we can see this with generative AI. Initially you just start right on the pirated data and you say that, well, we can't have intellectual property anymore, because if we are not able to take all the intellectual property and use it, then generative AI won't work well. Well, you could reframe this and say, well, why don't you first start on ethically sourced data sets? Likewise, we see this with a law that's creating unfair competition with taxis or hotels, etc., is that you first unfairly compete. And then later when there's market adoption, you say, well, wait a second, how can we possibly offer you this service if we don't unfairly compete, right? So this circular logic is very common with tech propaganda.